The caravan is safe. Abu Sufyan has already redirected it. He has already sent his rider galloping south to Makkah with the message, "The Muslims are watching the road. Take the coastal route. Come quickly. Come armed." By the time the army of Makkah receives that second message, the one that says the danger has passed, turn back, the caravan is home, Abu Jahl has already made his decision. He will not turn back, not because the caravan needs protecting, not because there is any tactical justification, but because Abu Jahl, whose real name was Amr ibn Hisham, whose title among the Quraysh was Abu al-Hakam, father of wisdom, whose title among the early Muslims was Abu Jahl, father of ignorance, cannot bring himself to walk away from what he has been promising for 2 years. He has been promising to destroy Muhammad. He has been promising to make an example of these people who dare challenge the authority of Mecca, the custodianship of the Kaaba, the supremacy of the Quraysh. And now, with 1,000 armed men behind him and water and food in abundance and musicians and singing girls accompanying the march for entertainment, he will not hear of retreat. We will not return, he says, until we have reached Badr. We will spend 3 days there, slaughter camels, feast, drink wine, and let the Arabs hear what we have done. That will make them fear us forever. In the court of recorded history, that is one of the more consequential miscalculations ever committed by a man in a position of power. Because 3 days later, in the valley of Badr, 70 of the Quraysh's greatest leaders are dead in the sand. 70 more are being led through the desert in rope as prisoners. And Abu Jahl himself is lying half alive in the dust, asking a young Muslim boy named Ibn Mas'ud, "Tell me who won the battle." We are going to tell you exactly how this happened. This is the House of Wisdom, and this is the Battle of Badr, fought in the month of Ramadan, in the second year after the Hijrah, in the year 624 of the Common Era, the first real battle of Islam. The battle that proved this was not a movement that would be extinguished. The battle whose aftershocks are still being felt 14 centuries later. But before we get to the valley, before we walk through the formations, before we stand at the wells, before we name the dead, we need to understand what was actually at stake. Because Badr was not simply a skirmish between a caravan escort and a religious community. Badr was the collision between two visions of what Arabia was going to become. On one side, an established order. Makkah as the center of the peninsula, the Quraysh as its gatekeepers, the Kaaba, filled with 360 idols, as the commercial and religious anchor of an entire civilization. A system that had made the Quraysh extraordinarily wealthy, that had given them alliances stretching to Rome and Persia, that had produced great poets and warriors and traders, a system that worked for the people at the top of it. On the other side, a 13-year-old message delivered by a man who had been driven from his home, who arrived in Medina with almost nothing, who was organizing a community out of refugees and former slaves and Bedouin farmers, a community that had been told by the Quraysh that it would be destroyed before it took root. The men marching with the Prophet of Allah to Badr were not a professional army. They had no cavalry to speak of. They had 70 camels shared among 313 men, most of them taking turns riding. They had 2 horses. They had swords and spears and bows, but nothing like the armored, provisioned, organized force coming from Mecca. What they had instead, and this is the thing that the analytical historians consistently undersell when they write about Badr, was a clarity of purpose that is almost impossible to replicate in any military formation in history. These men had already given up their homes and their families and their property and their social standing. They had already paid. The question at Badr was not whether they were willing to sacrifice. They had answered that question. The question at Badr was whether that sacrifice was going to mean anything. Now, before we go further, a question for you in the comments. And I want you to think about this carefully, because it gets to the heart of what this battle actually was. The Prophet of Allah asked his companions, "What do you think? Should we fight?" He already had permission from Allah. He already knew what was coming. He asked anyway. Why? Tell me in the comments what you think the wisdom was in asking his companions for their opinion, at a moment when the decision had, in a certain sense, already been made. The sequence of events that led to Badr began with a single order. The Prophet of Allah had been sending out small reconnaissance parties for months, watching the Quraysh trade routes, learning the terrain between Medina and the coast, establishing intelligence about who was moving and when. The largest of these expeditions had gone as far as the coastal town of Yanbu. None of them had resulted in a significant engagement. In the month of Sha'ban, in the second year of the Hijrah, news reached Medina that Abu Sufyan ibn Harb, one of the most powerful merchants in Makkah, a man who would later become one of the greatest characters in this entire series, was leading a very large and very rich caravan back from Syria. This was the annual summer trade caravan, the economic heartbeat of the Quraysh. It carried goods worth 50,000 mithqal of gold, 1,000 camels, the financial foundation of Makkah power for the coming year. The Prophet of Allah organized a force to intercept it. This is the context that the sources are very clear about. The purpose was not initially to fight a pitched battle. It was to apply pressure. to demonstrate that Medina existed, that the Muslims were a force, that the Quraysh's trade routes were no longer simply open roads. The goods in that caravan, some of the sources note, had been purchased in part with the properties confiscated from Muslims who had been forced to leave Makkah. There was a dimension of restoration in the mission, not just strategy. Abu Sufyan was an intelligent man. His scouts reported the Muslim movement before the interception could occur, and he shifted his caravan to the coastal route, avoided the ambush entirely, and sent his emergency rider south. His message to Makkah was, "My caravan is in danger, come with arms." What followed in Makkah has the quality of something that later historians struggled to explain cleanly, because it involves a civilization making a decision at its moment of maximum confidence that turned out to be its undoing. Makkah mobilized almost everything it had. The army that assembled was somewhere between 900 and 1,000 men. The sources vary slightly, with 600 armored fighters, 100 horsemen, and the remaining cavalry of the Quraysh. Abu Jahl was in command. Utbah ibn Rabi'ah, one of the great elders of the Quraysh, marched with him. Umayyah ibn Khalaf, the man who had tortured Bilal, marched with him. Abu Sufyan himself, when his caravan was safe, sent word back, "You can return. The caravan is safe. We don't need to fight." It was Utbah ibn Rabi'ah, of all people, a man who would die at Badr, who made the most clear-eyed assessment of the situation. According to the sources, Utbah stood up and argued against continuing. He said, "Muhammad's companions are people who have lost their families and properties. They are desperate. They will not run. If we fight them, we will either kill men who are our relatives, cousins, uncles, brothers, and live with that, or they will kill us, and that shame will never leave." He proposed turning back. Abu Jahl rejected the argument with contempt, and the army marched to Badr. The Prophet of Allah received news of the Quraysh army's movement and held his famous council. The sources preserve this council with remarkable detail. He stood before his companions and said, "The caravan has escaped, but the Quraysh have come with their army. Tell me what you think." Abu Bakr spoke first, and Ali, and both pledged absolute loyalty. But the Prophet of Allah kept asking, turning in different directions, until Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh of the Ansar understood that the question was meant for him and his people. Because the Ansar had pledged an Aqaba to protect the Prophet of Allah within Medina. They had not pledged to march out to meet armies. They had not pledged unlimited offensive warfare. The Prophet of Allah was giving them the opportunity to say, "This exceeds our covenant." Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh stood up. He said, "O Prophet of Allah, it seems as if you are directing your question at us, and we believe in you and we testify that what you have brought is truth. We have given you our pledge and our covenant to hear and obey. So march to whatever you intend. By the one who sent you with the truth, if you were to plunge into the sea, we would plunge in with you. Not a single man among us would stay behind. We are not afraid to face our enemy tomorrow. We are people of endurance in war and trustworthy in battle. Perhaps Allah will show you from us what will delight your eyes." The Prophet of Allah's face changed when he heard this. He gave the order to march. And here is where the historic war lens opens up, because what Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh said was not simply a pledge of military loyalty. It was a declaration about the nature of what they had built in Medina. Think about what this community had accomplished in less than 2 years. The Muhajirin had arrived in Medina as refugees, some of them so poor that they had nothing but the garments on their backs. The Ansar had taken them in, shared their property, shared their homes, established bonds of brotherhood that the sources describe as going beyond what blood relationships typically produce. And now, with no material incentive, with no promise of conquest, with the clear possibility of fighting people whose names they knew, whose children they might know, the Ansar stood up and said, "We're in." What the Prophet of Allah had constructed in Medina was not an army with a religious justification. It was a community that had made meaning its foundation, and from meaning, it had generated the kind of cohesion that no amount of gold or military training could reliably produce. At Badr, that cohesion was about to be tested against the most organized military force in Arabia, 313 men, against somewhere between 900 and 1,000. The Muslim force marched from Medina on the 8th of Ramadan, the first Ramadan that had ever been declared obligatory as a month of fasting. There is something worth holding in your mind about that. The first generation of Muslims to observe the Ramadan fast were doing so while organizing a military expedition. The experience of fasting, the hunger, the thirst, the discipline of restraint, the community of breaking fast together, was happening simultaneously with the experience of preparing for battle. This was not coincidence, and it was not accident. It was the formation of a complete human being, someone who could fast and fight, who could submit to the demands of worship and submission while also shouldering the demands of responsibility and action. The army arrived in the vicinity of Badr on the 16th of Ramadan, 2 AH. The valley of Badr was not accidental terrain. It was a known watering place, a stopping point for caravans traveling the road between Makkah and Syria. There were wells. There was ground that could support large formations. There was elevation, and there was lowland, and there was sand, and there was the constant wind off the desert. When the Muslim army arrived, they found that the Quraysh had already positioned themselves on the higher ground to the north, with the wells of Badr within or near their position. What happened next was one of the earliest recorded examples in Islamic military history of a commander making an active decision about terrain, rather than simply accepting the ground he found. The sources tell us that the companions began to establish their position in the place they had reached. A man named Al-Hubab ibn al-Mundhir, not a famous companion, not a senior figure, but a man who knew the terrain and knew military logic, approached the Prophet of Allah and asked him directly, "Is this position one that Allah has revealed to you and we cannot move from it? Or is it a matter of war and strategy and opinion?" The Prophet of Allah said, "It is war, strategy, and opinion." Al-Hubab then said, "Then it is not the right position. We should advance to the well closest to the enemy, camp there, destroy the wells beyond it, and build a cistern. So we drink and they do not." The Prophet of Allah implemented the recommendation immediately. This is worth pausing on because it tells you something essential about how the early Muslim military tradition actually worked. This was not a command structure that demanded deference to the senior figure on all questions. It was a command structure organized around correct judgment, and when someone had correct judgment, regardless of their rank, that judgment was adopted. Al-Hubab ibn al-Mundhir is not famous. He is not in the Blessed Ten. He did not receive personal prophecies about his paradise. But at Badr, before the first arrow was fired, he may have been the most important person in the Muslim formation. The Muslims moved, seized the nearest wells, filled in the others, built a cistern, and established a shelter on a slight elevation for the Prophet of Allah, from which he could observe the entire engagement and direct the battle. The Quraysh were now looking across at a formation that controlled the water, and in the morning, the battle would begin. But there is one more moment from that night that the sources preserve, and it is the kind of moment that does not belong in a tactical summary. It belongs here, at the end of part 1, because it establishes what this battle was actually rooted in. The night before Badr, the Prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prayed. He prayed for a long time. So long, the sources tell us, that he was still praying when the dawn came. He prayed with his face turned toward the Kaaba, and his hands raised and his words urgent and direct. He said, "O Allah, if you destroy this group today, you will not be worshipped on earth. O Allah, fulfill what you have promised me. O Allah, I ask you by your covenant and your promise." And then, according to Abu Bakr, who was with him, the Prophet of Allah fell into a brief sleep. He woke with his face illuminated, and he said, "Abu Bakr, be of good cheer. The help of Allah has come to you." Here is Jibreel, holding the bridle of his horse. 313 men, rested now, with the wells secured, with the cistern full, with the dawn breaking over a valley that would be, by the time the sun set, the most important piece of ground in the early history of Islam. The Quraysh are across the sand, and Abu Jahl, who refused to turn back, who insisted on this day, is about to discover that there are forces in this world that do not arrange themselves according to the confidence of wealthy men. The Valley of Badr, on the morning of the 17th of Ramadan, 2 the Quraysh army has spent the night on the higher ground to the north. They are well fed, they are rested, they have wine. The sources confirm the singing girls are there, the entertainment, the confidence of men who expected this to be a demonstration of power rather than a fight. Their scouts have now reported back what the Muslim army actually looks like. 313 men, 2 horses, 70 camels. A force that, by any conventional calculation of that era, should not be able to stand against what Makkah has assembled. Umayyah ibn Wahab al-Jumahi, one of the Quraysh scouts, rides his horse around the entire Muslim perimeter and comes back. His report is worth quoting from the sources, precisely, because it contains something that every experienced commander in history has understood, and that no amount of military theory can fully prepare you for. He says, "I see no supports and no reserves. I see the men of Medina crouching, waiting for death. They have no protection and no refuge except their swords. By God, I do not think a single man of them will be killed before he kills one of us. And if they kill of us a number equal to their own number, what is the good of life after that?" 313 men, and the Quraysh scout, looking at them across the sand, is already calculating whether surviving this engagement is worth the price. That is the quality of what the Prophet of Allah had assembled at Badr. Not a large force, not a well-equipped force, a force that had decided, in the language of Sa'd ibn Mu'adh's pledge, that it was not afraid to meet its enemy. Now the Quraysh send word across the sand. They send a message to their allies from Makkah, specifically to the Banu Zuhra and Banu Adi clans, that this is not their fight. This is a conflict between the Prophet of Allah's people and the Quraysh proper. Go home. Some of them do. The Quraysh army shrinks slightly before a single blow is struck. Abu Jahl watches them go and says nothing recorded in the sources. There is nothing useful to say. Then, in the tradition of Arabian warfare, the tradition this desert had followed for centuries before Islam, 3 men walk forward from the Quraysh line. Utbah ibn Rabi'ah, his brother Shaybah ibn Rabi'ah, and Utbah's son Walid. They walk to the center of the ground between the two armies, and they call for challengers of equal rank. This was the ritual opening of a battle in the Arabian tradition. Single combat between champions, conducted in full view of both armies, intended to establish momentum and morale before the general engagement. It was theater, and it was warfare simultaneously. The outcome of these duels would echo through the minds of every man in both formations when the real fighting began. 3 men stepped forward from the Muslim side: Auf ibn Harith, his brother Muawwidh, and Abdullah ibn Rawaha, all from the Ansar. Utbah looks at them and says, "We have no quarrel with you. Send us our equals, men of our own people." The Prophet of Allah turns to 3 men. He says, Hamzah, Ubayd ibn al-Harith, Ali ibn Abi Talib, rise. Hamzah ibn al-Muttalib needs a single sentence of introduction in this moment, because every viewer who comes to this episode needs to understand exactly who is stepping forward. Hamzah is the Prophet of Allah's uncle, his foster brother, the man who became Muslim when he heard that Abu Jahl had struck the Prophet of Allah on the street, and he walked straight to the Kaaba, found Abu Jahl sitting with his people, and hit him across the face with a bow. He is described in every source as the most physically powerful of the companions, a hunter, a warrior, a man who had been killing lions in the hills around Makkah since he was young. He is also, standing here at Badr, a man who has given up everything the Quraysh world had to offer because he believed in one thing. Ubaydah ibn al-Harith is one of the senior Muhajirin, a man in his 60s, respected and experienced. And Ali ibn Abi Talib, who has been in every episode of this series and will be in most of the episodes that follow, so I will say only this about him in this moment. Ali is 25 years old at Badr. He has been living in the Prophet of Allah's household since childhood. He was raised on this message. He slept in the Prophet of Allah's bed on the night of the Hijrah, so that the Quraysh encircling the house would not realize the Prophet ﷺ had left. He is, on this morning, the youngest of the 3 champions, and the one whose name, more than almost any name in this entire history, will echo through the centuries in ways that none of them can imagine. The 3 pairs separate. Hamzah faces Utbah ibn Rabi'ah. The sources are terse here, as the sources often are about moments of extreme violence. Hamzah kills Utbah. The blow lands, and it ends. Ali faces Walid ibn Utbah, the son of the man Hamzah just killed. Ali kills Walid. Ubaydah ibn al-Harith faces Shaybah ibn Rabi'ah, Utbah's brother. This duel goes differently. Both men strike each other simultaneously. Both fall. Hamzah and Ali, having finished their own engagements and moments, rush to Ubaydah's side and finish Shaybah. But Ubaydah's leg has been severed. He is carried back to the Muslim lines. He will die of his wound before the army returns to Medina. 3 duels, in roughly 3 minutes of combat. 2 of the Quraysh's most prominent elders are dead. The 3rd is dying. The son of one of them is dead. And now the Quraysh army, which has just watched its champions fall, makes the decision to charge. Let me give you the formations as they actually stood at Badr, because this is where the tactical picture needs precision. The Quraysh army, approximately 900 to 1,000 men, advanced on a broad front. Their cavalry, 100 horsemen, was positioned on the flanks, the standard deployment for this terrain. Their armored infantry formed the qalb, the center, the main striking mass. Their archers were distributed through the line. Abu Jahl commanded from the center. The entire weight of their formation was designed to overwhelm a smaller force through mass, to close distance quickly, engage in hand-to-hand combat where numbers and armor would be decisive, and collapse the Muslim line before it could regroup. The Muslim formation under the Prophet of Allah was arranged in 3 elements. The right wing, the Maymana, was commanded by Ali ibn Abi Talib. The left wing, the Maysara, was under the command of another companion, whose name the sources preserve, but who does not receive the attention he deserves at Badr. The center, the qalb, was directly under the Prophet of Allah himself, standing with Abu Bakr at the shelter on the slight elevation. This positioning was not passive. From this elevation, the Prophet of Allah had sight lines across the entire engagement. He was directing the battle in real time, calling forward reinforcements, identifying threats, maintaining awareness of the whole, while the individual commanders held their sectors. The ground between the 2 formations was open sand, the kind of ground that reflects heat and shifts underfoot and offers no natural cover and no natural advantage to either side except the wells, which the Muslims now held. The Quraysh were advancing into the sun, which was coming up in the east behind the Muslim line. Light into the eyes of an advancing army is not a trivial detail. It affects depth perception. It affects the ability to track projectiles. It affects everything that determines whether a man with a sword connects with his target. The Prophet of Allah gave an order before the Quraysh reached them. He said, "Do not advance until I command you. And when they approach, meet them with arrows. Do not draw swords until they come upon you." The archers on the Muslim side, relatively few, but positioned, were the first response to the Quraysh advance. The arrows slowed the front elements, created gaps, disrupted the formation's cohesion. Then, as the two lines closed to the distance where arrows give way to blades, the Prophet of Allah picked up a handful of dust. The sources record this moment in a way that the narration must honor directly. He took dust in his hand. He said, "May their faces be disfigured," and he threw it toward the Quraysh line. The Quran later said of this moment, "You did not throw when you threw, but Allah threw." Now here is where we hold the camera still, because this is the moment that every warrior in every army in this valley felt simultaneously. The sources tell us, and this detail comes from the Quraysh side, from men who survived and later told what they witnessed, that at the moment the dust was thrown, every man in the Quraysh army felt something strike his face and enter his eyes. Survivors later said, "We did not fight men. We fought men and something else, something we could not see." Whether you read that as a miracle or as the psychological report of men who were comprehensively defeated and needed a framework for their defeat, the tactical result was the same. The Quraysh formation, already disrupted by the arrow volley, already shaken by the fall of its champions, now lost its cohesion under the pressure of the Muslim countercharge. The Muslim line advanced. Now, a question I want you to sit with, and I want your answer in the comments. Because this question sits at the intersection of faith and military history, and I think the people who watch this channel can handle the tension in it. Was the dust thrown by the Prophet of Allah at Badr a military decision, a prophetic act, or both simultaneously? And what does it tell us about how the sources understand the relationship between divine intervention and human strategy in this battle? Drop your answer below. I read every single one. And if you are watching this and you have not subscribed, do it now. What is coming in the rest of this episode is the reason this channel exists. The men who are about to fight through this valley are the reason the world you live in is the world you live in. Hit subscribe so you do not miss part 3. In the chaos that followed the Muslim advance, the battle fragmented into dozens of individual engagements across the sand. This is the nature of close-quarters battle with bladed weapons. It does not stay organized for long. Formations dissolve. Commanders lose sight of whole sectors. Men are fighting the person in front of them and the person to their left and sometimes the person behind them, and the tactical picture that existed 30 seconds ago no longer exists. What keeps an army together in this environment is not formation. Formation is already gone. What keeps an army together is will. The willingness to stay and fight when every instinct says to run. The Quraysh were breaking. Not immediately. Not cleanly. The sources record fierce fighting across the whole front. Men from both sides were dying. 14 Muslims would be honored with martyrdom at Badr, 6 from the Muhajirin and 8 from the Ansar. The sources name them all, and the names belong in this narration because they are not statistics. Umayyah ibn Khalaf was eating dates when the Prophet of Allah ﷺ that paradise was as wide as the heavens and the earth. He threw the dates away. He said, "If I live until I finish these dates, it is too long." And he charged into the Quraysh line and was killed. His name was Umayyah ibn Khalaf. He was from the Ansar. He threw away his dates to die faster. On the Quraysh side, the sources record a detail about Umayyah ibn Khalaf, the man who tortured Bilal, who put the boulder on his chest in the midday heat of Makkah, who made Bilal say that the gods of the Quraysh were great, and who received in return only Ahad, one, that Umayyah was actually reluctant to march to Badr. Abdurrahman ibn Awf, one of the early Muslims who had been Umayyah's friend before Islam, encountered him on the march and they spoke briefly. Umayyah had a bad feeling about this. He wanted to go home. He did not go home. At Badr, when Bilal saw Umayyah among the prisoners, he called out, "The head of kufr," meaning the head of disbelief, "is not to live." And the Ansar who were near him fell on Umayyah before Abdurrahman ibn Awf could stop them. Umayyah ibn Khalaf, who put the boulder on Bilal's chest, died at Badr on the ground where Bilal's brothers in faith found him. The sources do not moralize about this. They simply record it. This history is not a story about perfect people. It is a story about people in an extraordinary moment. And the ledger of Badr contains both the dates thrown away for paradise and the prisoner killed by the man he had tortured. Then there is Mu'adh ibn Amr ibn al-Jamuh. Mu'adh ibn Amr is one of the young men of the Ansar. He is not famous. He will not have an entire episode dedicated to his life. He appears at Badr, he does one thing, and then he recedes back into the historical record as a name attached to a single extraordinary moment. He fights his way through the Quraysh line to Abu Jahl, the man who has been the chief architect of the persecution of Muslims for a decade, the man who ordered the torture of Bilal and Ammar and Sumayyah, the man who struck the Prophet of Allah on the street, the man who refused to turn back from Badr when the caravan was already safe, and he strikes Abu Jahl's leg with his sword. The blow connects. The sword cuts through the leg at the shin. Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl, Abu Jahl's son, fighting beside his father, sees this happen and swings his own sword at Mu'adh's arm in response. The blow nearly severs it at the shoulder. Mu'adh's arm hangs by a thread of flesh and skin. Mu'adh keeps fighting. The sources say he fought the entire rest of the battle with that arm hanging. When the weight of it dragging against his body made it impossible to continue, he stepped on it, on his own arm, and pulled until it separated, and then he left it in the dust and kept fighting. This is not a metaphor. This is not a literary device. This is what the sources record. Mu'adh ibn Amr ibn al-Jamuh, at the Battle of Badr, severed his own nearly detached arm with his foot and continued fighting. And Abu Jahl, struck down by Mu'adh, struck again by Mu'awwidh ibn Afra in the same engagement, lay dying on the ground. He was not yet dead when the battle ended. The Quraysh line collapsed. The survivors ran. They ran in the direction of Makkah, south through the desert, abandoning their water, their equipment, their dead. 70 of the Quraysh's greatest names were left in the sand. Another 70 were captured. The Muslim army, exhausted and bloodied, stood in a valley that 2 hours earlier had been contested ground, and now belonged to them. The Prophet of Allah came down from the shelter on the elevation. He walked across the battlefield. At some point in that walk, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, a small man, one of the early Muslims, a man who had once been a shepherd boy and was now a companion who had memorized the Quran in its earliest form, found Abu Jahl. Abu Jahl was lying in the sand, half dead, fading. Ibn Mas'ud put his foot on Abu Jahl's neck. Abu Jahl looked up at him and said, "You have climbed high, little shepherd." Ibn Mas'ud said, "Islam has made me rise, and it has made you fall." He asked Abu Jahl, "Who won the battle?" Abu Jahl said, "The battle has gone to your side. But tell me, is there anything worse for a man to die at than to be killed by his own people?" Then he said, "Cut my head off as close to the shoulders as you can so it looks bigger." Ibn Mas'ud cut his head off. He brought it to the Prophet of Allah. The Prophet of Allah said, "This is the pharaoh of this ummah, 70 dead, 70 captured. The wells of Badr in Muslim hands, 14 martyrs on the Muslim side. The first real battle of Islam, the battle that proved to every tribe on the Arabian Peninsula that this community was not going away, was over before the day was out. But there is something that happened in the hours after the battle ended that carries as much weight as anything that happened during it. And it belongs in the closing of part 2, not because it is dramatic. It is actually quiet, but because it answers a question that the sources force us to ask about the character of the men who built this. The prisoners were brought to Medina. The Prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala distributed them among the companions and said, "Treat them well." Abu Aziz ibn Umayyah, the brother of Mus'ab ibn Umayyah, one of the greatest early missionaries of Islam, the man who had gone to Medina and converted entire tribes before the Hijrah, was among the prisoners. He was the standard bearer of the Quraysh army. He later described what happened. He said, "I was in the custody of a group of the Ansar. When they sat to eat, they gave me bread and ate dates themselves. If any piece of bread came into the hand of one of them, he would give it to me. I would feel embarrassed and try to return it, and the man would push it back to me, untouched. The Ansar were fasting. It was still Ramadan, and they gave their bread, the food with which they would break that fast, to the man who had just fought them with a sword. That is Badr, not just the formations, not just the champions, not just the dust thrown into the wind, but the bread given to the prisoner in the evening, at the time of breaking the fast, in the month that changed the world. The prisoners have arrived in Medina, 70 men. Some of them are uncles of the companions. Some are cousins. Some are men who tortured the early Muslims in Makkah, who held Bilal down in the midday sun, who put fire to Khabbab ibn al-Arat's back, who drove the Muhajirin from their homes and confiscated everything they owned. Some are men who simply marched to Badr because Abu Jahl told them to, and they did not have Utbah ibn Rabi'ah's courage to argue back. The rope does not distinguish between them. They are all prisoners, and the Prophet of Allah must decide what to do with them. This council, the prisoner debate at Badr, is one of the most consequential governance moments in the early history of Islam. The sources preserve it with a level of detail that suggests the companions who were there understood, even in the moment, that they were watching something worth remembering precisely. Two men argue opposite positions. A decision is made. A Quranic revelation comes. And the lesson that falls out of this sequence is not what either man arguing expected. The Prophet of Allah assembled his senior companions and asked, "What do you say about these prisoners?" Abu Bakr al-Siddiq spoke first. He said, "O Prophet of Allah, they are your people and your family. I think you should take ransom from them. This will give us strength against the disbelievers, and perhaps Allah will guide them to Islam, and they will become a support for us." Then Umar ibn al-Khattab spoke. He said, "O Prophet of Allah, I do not agree with Abu Bakr. I think you should hand every prisoner to his relative among us, so that we can cut off his head. Hand Ali the task of killing Aqil. Hand me the task of killing my own relative. So-and-so. These men are the leaders of disbelief and its pillars. If we kill them, Allah will strengthen Islam." Two men who loved the Prophet of Allah more than they loved their own lives. Two men who had given up everything for this message. Two men whose judgment the Prophet of Allah respected above almost any others in the community, and they could not have disagreed more completely. The Prophet of Allah did not announce his decision immediately. He went aside. When he came back, he said, Allah softens the hearts of some men until they become softer than silk, and Allah hardens the hearts of some men until they become harder than stone. Your likeness, Abu Bakr, is like Ibrahim, who said to his people, whoever follows me is of me, and whoever disobeys me, then indeed you are forgiving and merciful. And your likeness is like Isa, who said, if you should punish them, indeed they are your servants, but if you forgive them, indeed it is you who is the exalted in might, the wise. And your likeness, Umar, is like Nuh, who said, my Lord, do not leave upon the earth any creature from among the disbelievers. And your likeness is like Musa, who said, our Lord, destroy their wealth and harden their hearts. He accepted ransom. The prisoners were released in exchange for payments ranging from 1,000 to 4,000 dirhams per man. Those who could not pay in money were allowed to earn their freedom by teaching 10 Muslim children to read and write. And then the revelation came. The Quran said in Surah Al-Anfal, it is not for a prophet to have prisoners until he has subdued the enemy thoroughly in the land. You desire the goods of this world, but Allah desires the hereafter for you. And Allah is exalted in might and wise. This is a moment the narration must sit with, because the revelation does not say Abu Bakr was wrong and Umar was right. It does not vindicate one position and condemn the other in simple terms. It says something more uncomfortable and more instructive, that both positions contained a legitimate vision of the values at stake, and that the decision made, taking ransom, prioritized the goods of this world over a harder, longer, more painful path. The revelation was not saying, you sinned. It was saying, you chose the easier mercy over the sterner wisdom, and you should know that you did it. This is the kind of governance lesson that does not have a clean resolution. The companions who were there understood it as a rebuke, mild, contextual, but real. The choice to ransom rather than execute the prisoners of Badr was the more humane choice. It was also, the Quran implies, the choice made with one eye on the immediate material gain of ransom money and the restoration of family ties, rather than purely on the long strategic calculation of what eliminating the leadership of Makkah's resistance might have meant for the years ahead. 14 of the men ransomed at Badr would later return to fight against the Muslims. Some of them died at Uhud on the Quraysh side. Some of them lived long enough to convert to Islam and become extraordinary contributors to the Muslim community. Both things are true simultaneously. The mercy shown at Badr cost something. It also built something. And the ledger of what it cost and what it built is not something any human calculator can fully run. What I can tell you, from the position of the historic war lens, zooming out from this valley to the century that followed, is this. The prisoner debate at Badr established a precedent for Muslim governance that outlasted the specific decision. It established that the governing council of this community would argue, that it would argue openly in front of the Prophet of Allah with real disagreement between people of equal stature and equal commitment, that the person with authority would hear both arguments fully before deciding, and that when revelation came to correct or comment on the decision, it would be received, not suppressed, not reinterpreted away, not softened, but received and transmitted to the community in full. That is a governance architecture, and it was built at Badr as surely as any formation on the sand. Now, before we go further into what Badr actually meant, I want to ask you something directly, because this episode is a Ramadan special, and the question belongs to Ramadan specifically. The men at Badr were fasting. They had been fasting since the 8th of Ramadan. They fought the battle on the 17th, 9 days into the fast. They fought with hunger and thirst already in their bodies, with the sun overhead, in armor that traps heat, in sand that reflects it back upward. And then, as the sources record, the Ansar who were given prisoners to guard gave their iftar bread to those prisoners and ate only dates themselves. What do you think that says about the relationship between fasting and character? Not as a religious statement, as a human observation. The fast was already shaping these men into something. Badr was the test of what it had shaped them into. Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know what you think. And if you are watching this channel during Ramadan and you are not yet subscribed, this is the moment. This month, this episode, this story, subscribe now so that what we cover next finds you. Hit the button. Let us now look at what Badr produced, not in the next week, in the next decade. The first thing Badr produced was a reckoning in Makkah that the sources describe with vivid specificity. The survivors staggered back to Makkah carrying news that the Quraysh establishment, led by Abu Jahl, organized around 360 idols in the Kaaba, resting on a millennium of Arabian tradition, had been met by 313 men in Ramadan and had come apart. There was not a household in Makkah that did not go into mourning. Abu Lahab, the Prophet of Allah's uncle, one of the most vehement opponents of Islam, the man for whom an entire chapter of the Quran had been revealed naming him by his title, heard the news of Badr, and within a week he was dead. The sources say he died of shock and grief. The second thing Badr produced was a reorganization of the opposition. Abu Sufyan ibn Harb, whose caravan had started this entire chain of events, who had not been at Badr because he was leading the caravan, now became the effective leader of the Quraysh resistance. He was smarter than Abu Jahl. He was more patient. He was more strategically capable. And he immediately began planning Uhud. The 50,000 mithqal in gold from the trade caravan whose protection had brought the army to Badr was not distributed to the shareholders. It was reinvested in weapons and armor, and a new army that would march to Medina the following year. Badr produced Uhud. The defeat sharpened the Quraysh's focus and stripped away their complacency. The year of preparation that followed Badr was more serious, more organized, and more dangerous than anything they had mounted before. The third thing Badr produced, and this is the one that the historians who write about Islam most consistently underemphasize, was a change in the internal architecture of what it meant to have been at Badr. Within the Muslim community, the companions of Badr occupied a specific and permanent category. They were the people who had been there at the moment of first proof. They were the people about whom the Prophet of Allah later said, "Perhaps Allah looked at the people of Badr and said, 'Do what you wish, for I have forgiven you.'" The companions of Badr were numbered 313, named, known, and that number and those names carried a weight in Islamic jurisprudence, in political authority, in social standing that persisted for generations. When the Caliph Umar ibn Khattab, years later, organized the stipend system for the Muslim community, the companions of Badr received the highest allocation, not because of wealth, not because of family, because of Badr. This is how civilizations mark their foundational moments, not only in monuments or official holidays, but in the living ledger of who was present and what that presence means. The Battle of Badr became within the lifetime of its participants, the event by reference to which everything else in early Islamic history was measured. You were either someone who had been at Badr, or you had not. The line between those two categories was permanent. The fourth thing Badr produced arrived on the 18th of Ramadan, 2 the day after the battle. A rider came to Medina from Badr with news of the victory. He found the city in an unusual state. There was grief in one household, and anticipation in another, and the specific compound quality of emotions that descends on a community that has sent its men to a battle and is waiting to learn who has come back. Uthman ibn Affan was in Medina. He had not gone to Badr, not from unwillingness, but because his wife Ruqayyah, the daughter of the Prophet of Allah, was gravely ill, and the Prophet of Allah had asked him to stay and care for her. While the Battle of Badr was being fought, Ruqayyah died. Uthman was burying her when the rider arrived with the victory news. The sources record this conjunction with an economy that is almost unbearable. The victory of Badr and the death of Ruqayyah arrived in Medina on the same day. The Prophet of Allah's army won the battle that proved Islam would survive. And the Prophet of Allah's daughter, who had gone to Abyssinia with her husband to escape the Quraysh's persecution and come home to a city that was being built into something worth believing in. She died in Medina on the day her father's community proved it was going to live. Uthman ibn Affan received his share of the booty from Badr, equal to the men who fought, because the Prophet of Allah counted his vigil at his wife's sickbed as a service to the mission. And the Prophet of Allah, when he returned, wept at the grave of his daughter. He was a man who won battles and wept at graves. He was a man who threw dust into the wind and told his companions that the army they saw across the sand was going to fall, and then distributed the bread of the prisoners to the prisoners themselves. He built a community that argued openly about governance in front of him and received the argument without humiliation to either party. He signed a peace treaty that looked like surrender and called it a clear victory. He entered Makkah with 10,000 men and forgave the people who had stoned him in Ta'if and dragged Bilal through the streets. This is the figure at the center of everything that Season 1 of this series covers. Not a king, not a general, though he commanded armies. Not a monk, though he prayed through the night. Something that the Arabian Peninsula in 624 CE had never produced before, and that the world has been arguing about and studying and returning to ever since. And Badr is where the argument became undeniable. 313 men, 1 month of fasting, the wells of a valley in the Hijaz, the bread given to the prisoner at iftar, the dust thrown into the eastern wind, and on the 18th of Ramadan, a rider galloping north through the desert toward Medina, with news that would change the direction of everything. The Ramadan that built a civilization, that is the Battle of Badr.